Well, good afternoon. It's so good to hear from Philip and Luke just now, and to hear them mention the fifth mark of mission and asking some fundamental questions about the role of their DAC. I'd like to ask a similar question, and that is, how can a DAC change the world? And in fact, come to think of it, how can a DAC change, full stop? Well, I'm going to tell you how we have started to answer those questions in Bristol. By way of context, I'm the chair of a DAC that is in the fortunate position to be able to be very proactive in the advisory part of its role and feels very much integrated into the mission objectives of its diocese. I'm also an architect whose experience centres mainly around finding creative and sustainable new uses for historic buildings. And I'm a Christian with long-held passions for issues of climate and the environment. And a while back, I was preoccupied by a problem. How can a DAC like ours become effective in helping parishes respond to climate change? And part of that problem is that the system is primarily reactive. It's parishes that make proposals and the DAC considers them and in essence supports them or otherwise seeks to refine them until they can be supported. So if, for example, a parish with an aging gas boiler asks for permission to replace it with a new one, we might push for better efficiency or a better control system, but ultimately we'd most likely end up saying yes, issue a recommendation and thus commit that parish to a generation or more of burning fossil fuel and emitting tons of carbon. So how could we bring about radical and essential change in the context of a DAC process and a faculty system where the traditions and legal frameworks are intrinsically resistant to change? How could we change everything so that low and zero carbon thinking are the norm, an embedded philosophy that form part of the approach from the very beginning at parish level and throughout the process? That might mean a shift from the traditional model of heating advisors drawn from industry with expertise focused on gas and oil systems to a framework that priorities low carbon alternatives. It would probably mean promoting solutions that typically have a higher capital cost, when for many parishes funding is a real issue. It might be that we would have to fundamentally rewrite the faculty jurisdiction rules to accommodate an entirely different way of thinking. How could we change something that isn't easily changed and bring everyone along with that process so that we can respond effectively to the pressing issue of climate change? And for that matter, why? Much as we each have a responsibility to do something about this global crisis, why should a DAC bother? Difficult questions. I can recall many years ago now, my Sunday school leader once gave me some very good advice. He said, if you're ever put on the spot and asked a difficult question in church, the answer is usually something to do with God. And so it is. Since a DAC is part of the church, and the church's focus is, in essence, God, and since the planet whose condition concerns us so much is God's creation, then the answer to the question, why bother, is all about God. The Worldwide Anglican Communion reached that very conclusion in 1984 when it adopted the 5 marks of mission, the 5th of which is to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. So when a chancellor weighs harm against benefits and applies the accepted definition of benefits, which includes opportunities for mission and putting the church to viable uses consistent with mission, then environmental considerations already count as in themselves a hugely positive component. So it turns out that radically shifting the entire emphasis of faculty jurisdiction was easy and in a sense already available all the time. By simply identifying sustainability as an act of mission, we could, within the existing rules, raise the bar high and say that as a DAC, we start with zero carbon, unless it can be demonstrated that this isn't possible. It would mean that we could enthusiastically support a parish whose proposals were sustainable, perhaps even when their proposals were otherwise less readily recommended. And we checked with the registry and they agreed, so we made that shift. And we had at that point already moved away from the traditional heating advisor approach and secured O'Varapan Partners as our heating advisors. And they thankfully embraced our shift and adopted a new title as Sustainability Advisors. And what followed was the creation of a Diocesan Sustainability and Environmental Justice Policy and the adoption of a 2030 net zero carbon target, now of course matched by General Synod. It's not a competition, so I won't mention that we were the first to do that. But actually, very compellingly, it not being a competition is exactly the point. It is about the church, in this instance, particularly parishes and DACs, acting with a common mission ambition. And if we'd had any thoughts at the beginning that sustainability as mission was merely a bit of a device to help us change emphasis, that was soon dispelled by the compelling sense of God at work through mission that has been evident throughout. It has rarely been an issue that raising the bar would somehow need to be imposed on parishes. They got it with enthusiasm. The process has prompted many conversations and real connections between parishes, between denominations, and between church and secular worlds. And it's also addressed some of the myths that DACs like to say no to things. Parishes in the Bristol Diocese no longer say things like, we didn't even ask about solar panels because we thought the DAC wouldn't let us have them. So we've come a long way, but we have an awful long way to go. Thinking of sustainability as an act of mission is all very well, but it is not in itself mission, or for that matter, action.